What's your go-to for binging? Sugar, Netflix, shopping, work, exercise? The word gluttony is usually associated with overeating, but there's more to it than that. This quote-unquote sin is about insatiable desire of all kinds, a hunger that doesn't go away no matter how much you feed it. My name's Hazel Gale. I'm a former therapist turned author and creator of the Betwixt app. And in this video, we're going to explore this so-called deadly sin, not to judge it, but to understand it. Why do we crave? Why do we consume past the point of satisfaction? And what can an ancient story about eternal hunger teach us about the way we live today? So what's going on with this? Why do we get into these impulsive, obsessive, and self-destructive habits? And what can we learn from the fate of Tantalus in order to avoid these binds? King Tantalus, from whose name we get the verb to tantalize, was favoured by the gods and often invited to divine dinner parties up on Mount Olympus. Despite this privilege, though, Tantalus was arrogant and ungrateful, and he used his time with the gods to learn their secrets and steal divine food, both of which he shared among his mortal friends in order to prove his own superiority. What a guy. The most infamous of Tantalus's crimes was a grotesque attempt to test the gods' omniscience. One day he killed his own son, Pelops, cooked him into a stew, and served him at a banquet to see if they'd notice. Other than Demeter, who, distracted by her grief, consumed a piece of Pelops' shoulder, the gods knew what was being served up, and, enraged by his arrogance, they punished Tantalus. Zeus cast him into the underworld, where he was made to stand for eternity in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. Whenever he bent down to drink, the water would recede. Whenever he reached up to grab the fruit, the branches would lift higher, keeping it forever out of reach. Parched and ravenous, Tantalus remains there today, surrounded by abundance, but never able to satisfy his desire. Tantalus, in fairness, represents more of the deadly sins than just gluttony. He's hubristic, pride, envious of the gods, and greedy for power too. I chose his story for this video because Tantalus's punishment serves as such a poignant representation of what it feels like to be in any kind of addictive or dependent cycle. Compulsive eating, drinking, gambling, exercising, etc. When no matter what we do or how hard we strive, true satisfaction always remains just out of reach. In terms of food-focused gluttony, part of the problem is that our brains, which evolved much slower than the world around us, are wired for a very different kind of life. We are neurologically programmed for a time when food was scarce and storage difficult. In other words, our brains still think it's a good idea to eat as much as we can whenever it's available. Neurologically, the drive for food involves dopamine, the want-more neurotransmitter, and enkephalin, which is an opioid receptor. These two things combined make food and eating highly addictive, which is necessary. Of course, we need it to survive, but also potentially problematic. Overeating and obesity are hugely stigmatized in our culture. We judge those who we see as overweight harshly, rapidly, and unfairly. Studies show that the stigmatization of obesity is linked to the perception of personal responsibility. People perceived as overweight are assumed to be lazy, weak-willed, and gluttonous, which, as we'll explore, is not necessarily the case. To make matters worse, these harmful prejudices are commonly dismissed as acceptable and even necessary, a viewpoint driven by the assumption that obesity is de facto under our personal control, and those who struggle with it just need a good kick up the backside. At the heart of all this is another dangerous assumption, that eating is inherently pleasurable, and that those who eat more than we might consider necessary are therefore impulsive hedonists who can't keep their urges under control. However, neuroimaging of both obese and non-obese brains, says author Mark Schatzker, shows this pleasure-seeking assumption to be false. Not only do obese brains create a much more powerful craving for food than non-obese brains, they also experience dampened levels of pleasure from eating. In other words, obese people will experience less joy from drinking a milkshake than non-obese people, but they'll still be driven to do so by an automatic, obsessional craving that makes the milkshake feel like a matter of life or death. What this means is that it just does not make sense to brand people who struggle with their weight as weak-willed, lazy, or hedonistic, and doing so is more likely to exacerbate the problem by isolating and ostracizing people who need care and connection, not discipline. And of course, it's not only people in the obese category who overdo things. Enter the Existential Escape Hypothesis, which, in the words of Dr. Andrew Moynihan, states that when people experience a threat to their sense of meaning in life, they might engage in gluttonous behaviour as a way to escape from that experience. The act of eating, along with other bingeable pastimes like watching TV and even exercising, only demand basic, evolutionarily old mental processes. This means that disappearing into the trance-like state provided by these activities gives us respite. We get to temporarily switch off from the pain, dread, confusion and uncertainty brought on by big, difficult experiences like trauma and grief, and also objectively smaller forms of discomfort like boredom, loneliness, and the inescapable reality of our mortality. So, when something threatens our sense of meaning, purpose, connection, or our very existence, turning to food, drink, gambling, working out, or pretty much anything else we've made a habit out of can be seen as a solution. It's a temporary and ineffective one, but a solution nonetheless. Returning to today's myth, what if we were to see Tantalus's actions not as malicious, greedy impulsivity, but as a reflection of profound, unacknowledged hunger? Tantalus lived in a kind of liminal space between the gods and mortal men. Viewed through the lens of Jungian psychology, the gods can be said to represent the divine perfection of the self, the wholeness and completeness towards which we may strive but will never truly experience in our human lifetimes. Stealing the ambrosia and nectar, revealing divine secret, and even the grotesque act of sacrificing his son could all be viewed as Tantalus's misguided attempts to bridge the gap between his mortal limitations and the divine perfection he so craved. We all know what it's like to find ourselves reaching for satisfaction that proves to be forever out of reach. For most of us in the West, it's not basic needs like food and drink that we can't get our hands on, but the deeper, slipperier needs of love, connection, self-worth, wholeness. We say to ourselves, if I could just win that award, publish a bestseller, lose 10 kilos, or start making 6 figures, then I'll feel enough. But if and when we meet these targets, the satisfaction we experience is disappointingly short-lived, because we quickly realize the accolade, money, beauty, or prestige does not deliver inner wholeness, inner enoughness. Just like Tantalus, we find ourselves in a perpetual state of wanting and needing more, but having no real way to get in touch with it. Tantalus's final predicament, then, serves as a potent metaphor for this kind of inner psychological disconnect between the ego, or the conscious thinking self, and the shadowlands of unconscious and therefore unmet needs, values, and desires. In the myth, the smaller transgressions of theft and divulgence were overlooked by the gods. We were all allowed to make mistakes. It was only when Tantalus sacrificed his own son in an attempt to outfox the gods and therefore level the playing field that they took action. Pelops here can be seen as a representation of the child archetype, symbolic of hope and transformation. His sacrifice, therefore, marks the moment when Tantalus loses hope, when he loses himself to the pursuit of more. It was this that was punished, and this that led to Tantalus's eternal state of unsatisfied hunger. The good news is that Pelops was resurrected by the gods and his shoulder replaced with ivory. He went on to be a chariot racing king, beloved by Poseidon. So although Tantalus's story seems to end in such misery, his essence and hope did live on. And ours can too, no matter how deeply we might feel we've fallen into any kind of gluttonous cycle. In much the same way as we discussed in the episode on greed, the way to alchemize gluttony is to see if we can start channeling it in better ways. I'm not suggesting it's easy, and I'm certainly not proffering a cure for obesity. That would be a whole different discussion and one to be had with a medical doctor. But there are ways to think about our cravings and habits that could stymie the existential escape problem and also help us to take back control of our self-destructive patterns. Moynihan suggests that actively seeking and choosing to engage in activities that bring us a sense of meaning can stave off the existential dread that may otherwise lead us into mindless escapism. Whether we find meaning in music, art, movement, connection, philosophy, acts of service, or whatever, it may be possible to swap our self-destructive binges for deep dives into things that actually matter to us. And the more we do those things, the better guarded we'll find ourselves against the threats of boredom and loneliness and mortal dread going forward. In theory, the positives should snowball. But, of course, life throws curveballs too. We will all struggle along the way, and we may turn to addictions and dependencies during those times. I would hope that awareness of what's going on in those situations may help us to find our feet faster as we heal. I also hope that it may help us to empathise with others when they are struggling. And, although I must repeat that I'm not touting this as a cure for addiction, obesity, or any other serious condition, I would urge you to consider this final thought. What if your cravings conveyed a deeper message, no matter what it might be that you gravitate towards? Consider when and where those cravings surface for you, and then ask yourself what's really missing in those situations. To seek meaning is to seek a life of fullness, authenticity, and self-connection. This will rarely be the easy way out, but in the long term, it will almost certainly be the better choice.